Excellent. Wonderful.
Got it.
Very briefly, welcome everyone to the next installment of the Learning Experience Design webinar series presented by the Design and Development Division of AECT. Today with us, we have Karin Forssell and Keith Bowen, who will be presenting the presentation that they have in front of you. They will also be presenting themselves, so I won't belabor the point. And on that note, I'll go ahead and pass the microphone to you. We're very excited for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to check, are you seeing just one frame or are you seeing my whole desktop?
I am seeing your whole desktop.
Okay, let me fix that 1 second. I picked the wrong one. There we go. All right, just wanted to make sure that we had the right thing happening. Greetings, everybody. Very lovely to be here today. On behalf of Keith and myself, we're very excited to share with you about our work in thinking about theories of change for learning experience design, something we think is very important. By way of brief introductions, Keith is the senior manager and lecturer in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. I'm the senior lecturer and director of the Learning Design and Technology Master's Program. And together we wrote a chapter together with our colleague Soren Rosier called Theories of Change in Learning Experience Design in the book Learning and User Experience Research, which Matthew has probably shared many, many times before. We're here to talk about that chapter today, but first I'd like to do a little warm up to get us all on the same page. So if you would humor me, I'd like to ask you, how do you define learning? And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and answer that question in a poll, which I will put here in the chat. You can either go to click the link, pollev.com/learning design, or text learning design to 37602. I'll give everybody a moment to respond. How do you define learning? Everybody getting in there okay? I see 3 results. I'll wait for just a couple more. Somebody's still typing, I hope. All right, I'll go ahead and take a look at the responses we've gotten so far. And, ooh, that's a cool combination of words. Knowledge, process, skills. We've got some effort in there. Some improvement, cognition, behavior, measurable. Great feedback. I really like a lot of these words. They are happy words for me because I really love to see learning. So I'll share with you what my definition is, and then I'll explain why I was asking. My definition of learning is a change in what learners can do or say after an experience. And the reason that I think this is important is because change is what it's all about. As learning experience designers, we need to know the answers to 3 important questions. First, who are our learners? Second, what do we want them to be able to do or say? And third, how are we going to effect that change from where they are now to where they're going next. And so that's why I find it really important to talk about a theory of change. Today, we hope that we'll convince you to use theories of change in your work. I should mention in passing that some of you may have experience with logic models. For example, the Every Student Succeeds Act Tier 4 level of evidence calls for a well-founded logic model. For the purposes of this webinar, they are the same. We'll offer you some suggestions for further reading at the end that include some articles about both theories of change and logic models. So why do we care about theories of change, about actually explaining them, defining them, and using them in our work? There are a lot of different things that they contribute. First of all, theories of change explain how designers expect to shift learners' knowledge, skills, and abilities. So communication is at the core of this. As a form of communication, they align the expectations of the team. Again, very important that you're all working towards the same thing. At first, they can be based on gut instinct, but sharing them allows designers to recognize assumptions and connect their ideas to research, which often in the process raises different questions that you want to go and check about. Sometimes those questions are answered by the literature, and sometimes you have to go out and test prototypes and ask people to find out the answers. Theories of change play out in design decisions all the time. The features that are included in digital learning tools and in the activities chosen for learners in technology-enhanced learning experiences are all sort of informed by our theories of change, even if they're not articulated. We all have theories of change, but by articulating them, it's also possible to recognize ways in which we can identify whether this particular design is working. So the clearer the theory, the more specific and measurable the indicators, and reliable focused measures are key to ensuring that a design is working as planned. But not just after everything is done, also during the process. So it allows designers to test early and figure out, gather data in various rough and easy and early ways that help to inform the development of a particular learning experience. So that's why we think that theories of change are so important to articulate, but it might be a little bit nebulous until you see some examples. So today we're going to share with you a couple of different examples of how students that we have worked with in the Learning Design and Technology program, LDT at Stanford, have used their theories of change to inform the design, build on learning theory, design and develop their features, and also to measure learning to check that what they had created actually worked. So these are a little bit older. They were designed in 2006 and 2010 originally, but they are both real life products that are out there now and that have, after the students were in the program, they went on to run real studies that have proven efficacy. So we can show sort of the whole arc of that project lifespan. So I'll go ahead and start with a brief introduction to motion math. Founded in 2010 by students Gabriel Arauto and Jacob Klein in the LDT program, and more recently, after they went on for several years as a company of their own and grew as Motion Math Games, they were acquired by Curriculum Associates. And I'll go ahead and just put in the chat in case you want to look them up and learn a little bit more about them. But what you won't find online is their origin story. And I can tell you that when they first started, they were really interested in helping kids learn math, but they weren't really convinced about what they should learn. So they started out by asking teachers to name the most difficult concepts to teach and for children to understand. And they learned that fractions were a stumbling block for many, many students. So why are fractions so hard to teach? It's not that we don't have textbooks. We have lots of great materials, but they are consistently challenging because there are so many different symbolic representations that create confusion. So even if a student has a something of an understanding of what parts of a whole might mean, it's difficult to translate that into various representations in mathematics class. So translation turned out to be a big topic for Gabriel and Jacob, and they went looking for tools that already did that. They found SimCalc, which was a tool that actually did a really good job and had been demonstrated to substantially increase learners' understanding of algebraic concepts by presenting different representations of the same, in this case, it was algebra. And that's important because algebra is actually founded on fractions. And a review of the literature confirmed that poor or incomplete understanding of fractions is associated with struggles with algebra. Algebra, in turn, is a gateway topic for college readiness. It's really important to get this right. The other thing that fractions do is turn kids off of math. And it was really, really important to Gabriel and Jacob to make sure that this was learning and fun. It's not a question of learning or fun. That's just a false dichotomy. Think of learning on one axis and fun on another. We want learning and fun up in their top right quadrant, if you will. So they started out with a sense of what they wanted to accomplish. They wanted to address, I would argue, 2 of the 3 learning domains, according to Bloom's original taxonomy: cognitive and affective. They wanted to help people understand the symbolic representation of math and to like it, because they wanted them to continue. So they decided to develop a game that would allow kids to play with fractions. Okay, so how did they go about doing that? The idea of play evokes freedom and fun. And very often, early grades, kids get to play a whole lot with fractions using various manipulatives. Manipulatives have a long history in the research of helping students in a form of embodied cognition. Unfortunately, sometimes the parts of a whole approach can lead to misconceptions, like the idea that you can't have parts of a group. So we need to be able to break out of some of the limitations of the manipulatives. And also, physical objects have a limitation in that they don't provide you with a whole lot of feedback. They have it fits or it doesn't. But our founders decided that they would present an opportunity to provide better feedback if they can move it into a digital platform. So that would take advantage of many of the things that games do really well, because games, they manage to match challenge level to skill level. And this is building on Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow. The idea that if you can get it in the right space here, people want to keep going. They lose track of time. They're fully immersed in the task. And let's be honest, how many students feel that when being confronted with fractions on a worksheet? So to try and create this opportunity, the Gabriel and Jacob decided to try to provide feedback and support for students so that they could stay in the flow, or maybe even a little bit past their current status of their current skill level to arousal, which is where learning really happens. So if we're going to go ahead and simplify this in a very easy representation, we've got this little diagram. So we have a learner on the left with understanding of basic math facts. We want them to understand fractions and have a positive affect towards math. We want them to like it, to want to play more. And using symbolic notations mapped to a physical experience based on the research with manipulatives, while also dynamically matching challenge to skill level. Now, this was 2010, and the iPhone was fairly new at the time. So they set out to figure out how they could use that handheld computer with sensors, because there's a gyroscope and an accelerometer built into every smartphone, to help kids have this experience. And what they made was Motion Math Bounce. It is now called Bounce. It was originally just called Motion Math. It was the first of many games that they eventually wound up working with. And the idea is that you get a number, it drops on the line, and you try to drop it on the right place on the number line. The numbers switch to different representations. There are pie charts, percents, decimals. The number line switches. Sometimes it goes negative. Sometimes there are mixed fractions. In this particular game, it's still all parts of a whole, but there are other games that actually deal with parts of groups as well. So then they had a prototype and they had to try and figure out early if people would use it and learn from it before they spent a whole lot of time and effort building it out. So they started out with this question of, will they use it? Will the students use it? But also, will the teachers use it? They started by interviewing a bunch of teachers about what level of teacher wanted this and whether it would work in a classroom, got some positive results. And then they turned to kids and they interviewed lots of kids. And you will, if you look for this video, actually, I'll give you the link, you can watch it later. There's a great testimonial at the end with this fifth grader down here on the right, Kira, saying it's a kid's dream of school. Interestingly, the kids were quicker to figure out how to use it than the grown-ups. The grown-ups wanted to just push to click because iPhones were so new, they didn't know how to just move it around. But the kids were pretty good to pick it up. So with this sort of encouragement that the kids would play it and the teachers wanted it, they then had to figure out how to make it effective. And so there was a lot of work put into this question of, was the feedback actionable? And so they tested a great deal. They put a lot of effort into getting the hints right. The scaffolding was really important. They did cognitive task analysis interviews with expert educators, and they developed hints that provide progressively more help to guide learners. I've only put two, the easiest and the hardest, or should I say the most minimal and the most extreme help on this slide, but there are different levels in between. The idea is that as kids play, they get more and more help so that they always are successful by the end. Will they learn from it? Ultimately, you sort of need a different kind of study for that. But after they finished the program, they were able to work with Michelle Risconsente from USC to do a study, a crossover study that did show in classrooms that the students had a better understanding of fractions, better attitudes, and willingness to complete more math problems after using Bounce than after regular instruction. So that was pretty much a success story all wrapped up. It wasn't as pretty during the thing, but it was pretty by the end. And now we're going to tell you one more story that was a little bit more messy. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Keith.
Get unmuted here. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so let's take another, let's look at another illustration using a program called Prevention Begins With Me, which was from the nonprofit TeachAids. This is also a program that came out of Stanford's teaching in the learning sciences and technology and design. A focus of my work is on building capacity in fragile states and zones of conflict. This study, or this case study by a colleague of ours, Pia Sorkar, is one that I particularly like to share. Next slide. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was another disease taking too many lives. And of course, here I'm referring to HIV/AIDS. Next slide. In the late 2000s, national and international health organizations were struggling to find effective ways to teach HIV/AIDS prevention, especially in low-income countries, which at that time were bearing the brunt of new infection. Misinformation about the disease was rampant. Traditional education programs weren't working very well. Next slide. So Pia and the teams that she recruited for this project turned to the learning sciences for ideas on how to do better. Next slide. So behavioral, cognitive, and constructivist theories of learning put much emphasis on how the individual learns. By contrast, sociocultural theories focus on learners within their wider social and cultural contexts. And it was here that Pia sensed the possibility of a breakthrough. Next slide. So specifically, Pia turned to the literature on the teaching of taboo subjects. And in this, she found much that seemed to correspond to the problem of teaching about HIV/AIDS. That's my cute graphic. So what was her idea? What was her hypothesis? So in its early version, her theory of change, which was informed by the learning sciences, was that culturally sensitive instruction taken to scale would lead to better understanding as well as better prevention. So combining research and insights from the learning sciences with iterative design methodology, she and her team actually did come to some useful breakthroughs. For example, they learned that anonymous self-paced learning modules work better than instructor-led courses. So why was this? It reduced embarrassment and stigma for both teachers and learners. So they started to conceptualize their product as a series of self-paced online learning modules. Next slide. They also learned that illustration and animation would work better than explicit photos and videos. So why? Well, explicit images were jarring, distracting, and illustration and animation could be carefully controlled. So they put their attention on this. Instead of focusing on questions of morality, they found it more productive to center the content on a straightforward biological foundation. They kept it calm and clinical, as shown here. They also used relatable characters. And when it was necessary to refer to sensitive topics, they used culturally informed metaphors. So instead of showing physical intimacy explicitly, they showed in parts this image of two doves. So those familiar with Bollywood storytelling would recognize two doves like this as a symbol of romantic love. So they took advantage of these conventions. So over the course of much research in the form of interviews and surveys and many design iterations, many design iterations, they came to a more detailed theory of change, which in brief was that within the context of an anonymous interactive website, content with a biological foundation rendered in accurate and accessible animations using culturally informed metaphors would lead to more understanding, less stigma, better choices, and ultimately fewer cases of HIV. So it's worth taking a brief look at how they interrogated this theory of change in extensive prototyping and user testing. So here we see data about what kinds of imagery users found uncomfortable. They did many surveys about what kind of imagery was explicit enough to convey meaning, but not too explicit to offend. And combining this with early user testing, picture of that in the next slide. And then the next slide, they found imagery that led to the right kind of balance. So this image tested well in terms of both its efficacy in terms of communicating the concept and then keeping users feeling comfortable. So they conducted many more surveys with different groups, different stakeholders. So in the case before, administrators who the images tended to make them feel uncomfortable. They created yet more iterations and did more testing. And they found that they could get rid of a lot of the explicit imagery and find more, again, take advantage of more conventions with imagery like this, which, for example, suggests a wedding night. So as their product got more refined, they, of course, tested at scale. And in fact, next slide, Pia built a whole dissertation around this work, which is a lot of effort, of course, and not every product goes to this length, but it's an enlightening example because the effort has led to a lot of success. Prevention with Begins With Me has been used by hundreds of thousands of learners all around the world. It's been adapted for use in over 80 countries, always taking the same kind of time and effort for effective localization. And the team has built on this success with a range of new products. So just to step back a bit and look at these really kind of different projects, we see that the specific theories themselves differ, but the framing is similar and equally beneficial. The idea that within the context of a handheld computer with sensors that maps symbolic relations to physical evidence and that dynamically matches the challenge to the skill level can take learners with, a basic understanding of math and help them develop an understanding of fractions and then to have positive feelings or affect towards math. And a similar kind of chain that young people before the program, a program using anonymous interactive learning modules based on a clinical biological foundation with accurate but accessible animations, accurate and accessible, and using culturally informed metaphors. It leads to better understanding, as we said, less stigma, good choices, and lower cases of HIV. So well-constructed theories of change that are developed over time through familiarity with the empirical science of learning and refined through rigorous prototyping and testing leads to these well-informed designs for addressing the learning problem.
So I'm going to go ahead and do one more example that's not in the chapter with you today, and that is specifically thinking about the individual activity that we did today of a poll everywhere at the beginning of the webinar. The truth is that you can have a theory of change, anything from program level, which is where the idea, the phrase theory of change comes from, is the program evaluation, all the way down to individual activities. And so I thought we might do this a little bit together to try and cement this insight. So again, we have learners and context. In this case, it'll be you, right? And our outcomes, I think, will probably be a mindset towards checking your assumptions and articulating your theories. The skills to do so, and some facts about where to learn more about it. And so I'm going to ask you to help me fill in the middle. And so I'll just put a question here in the chat. What was the core experience of the Poll Everywhere experience at the beginning of our webinar? So sort of what was that secret sauce in the middle that made that worth spending time on? Go ahead and answer to the chat. Take a moment, type your thoughts, and submit when you're ready. There is, of course, no wrong answer here. There are many possible right answers. This may have been a harder question than I realized. Well, having thought about it, let me tell you what my answer would be. I had more time to think about it before this presentation. So here's one way it could look, right? LX designers at a webinar are the learners. I would like to believe that better designs are what we're aiming for ultimately, because you're using theories of change, you have more communication of early ideas, more testing of prototypes, more revision to refine the idea. So how do we get there? I would say that one of the things that a poll does is give everyone a voice. And that's unique, right? Because in a classroom environment, one person speaks at a time, but these technologies such as a poll will allow lots of people to contribute all at the same time. Furthermore, all the contributes are visible to everyone. And what advantage does that give us? Well, for one thing, you're activating prior knowledge, right? So connecting what new information is coming to what you already know. You may be paying more attention because of the participation aspect. And you may be noticing some nuances that are coming up because of the sort of, oh, I didn't answer it that way. I noticed how the differences are between. That compare and contrast of perspectives provides, oh, nice, making our tacit, oh, look at all those great reflections and making our tacit assumptions explicit. Yeah, so that actually helps the teacher to understand, so what is going on here? Are there some misconceptions that need to be addressed, or are there differences that maybe the teacher hasn't thought about? You know, we're all learners. So hopefully that leads to a better, deeper understanding, better questions in the discussion, opportunities to really dig into these ideas. So.
Yeah, so we look forward to discussing this with you, but we'll just kind of take a second to consolidate a few takeaways. So we've found several advantages to this kind of articulation of clear theory of change. And just to circle back to where we started, that it helps in communicating the vision and aligning expectations, with teammates and with other stakeholders, highlighting assumptions and raising questions about them, testable hypotheses, which leads to productive testing, which then leads to informed design decisions, suggesting indicators to use in testing and informing the revisions. And just a couple of other thoughts. We've noted that beginning designers often confuse UX and LX, and they're similar, of course, but it does help to distinguish between them. We've also noticed that beginning designers often do have theories of change about learning, but they tend to be oversimplified, like assuming a sort of a straight line from lecture to exam. And these are a little bit like when people talk about naive theories in other sciences, so like naive theories of physics, that these oversimplified intuitions about learning can actually get in designers' way. And therefore, with this explicit framing of theory of change, can highlight the role of empirically based learning theory and then design iteration. So some of the key takeaways for us. And then in terms of additional readings, there's the article that Karin mentioned at the beginning, which details what we've been talking about here. Another one is the powers of theories of change. Theories of change comes from, as Karin mentioned, the world of nonprofits, and it's a little bit of a explanation of how this is conceptualized there and how it's migrated into other areas. Karin mentioned logic models, and it was similar, parallel way of framing it. And then this final article debunking the gold standard, which talks a little bit about more on the user testing and efficacy and kind of more of a deep dive in the ways that the value of this kind of thinking, especially in early stage framing of the product and understanding of its effects, and then carrying through to more elaborate testing, like some of the stuff that we've shared here.
So with that, we'd like to open it up to answer questions, chat with you, learn from you about what you're working on, and hopefully we'll learn something from you as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and would love for you to join us in talking about how we can do this better.
So guys, I don't know if I have a question. I have more of a comment, and it's in two parts. The first part is that the work that you presented in the Indian context with the sociocultural considerations is one of few studies or design cases which really interrogates and explores this issue of sociocultural nuance. It's something that's oftentimes ignored. And I think it's one of the key contributions of this work in that you're looking at sociocultural elements of experience and how that influences how designers go about experiencing it. So I just want to put that out there, that this is an excellent exemplar for others who might be working in this space. And the other piece is, as we were developing our edited volume, there were very few chapters that focused on theory. I'm curious, what spurred or what was the inspiration to conceptualize your process within this quasi-logic model?
This is something that we've been working on for a long time as part of our master's program. So when the call for papers came along, it was a fairly natural place to go for us. But I think part of that comes from, we're both from the learning sciences program. We both got our PhDs in learning sciences and technology design at Stanford. And it's always been something that I, for one, have thought about, is like, what is the role of theory in informing practice? And a master's program is at that intersection between like cutting edge research and trying to make something in the real world. And so I think that's why our courses have very often sort of naturally gravitated toward this question of like, what does the theory contribute to the design? And this was a great opportunity for us to really dig in and think deeply about that question. Keith, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head pretty well. So really it came from experience, from the experience of teaching and our own iterations for how we're teaching these learning design and technology master students. I also I mentioned at the beginning that I've worked in the world of nonprofits, and then this idea of theory of change is, and this explicit framing is pretty common there. But I think Karin's point about the learning sciences, so yes, exactly that that a premise of the learning design and technology program is that students will be informed consumers of learning science research, and in some cases producing it, and that a core tenet of the program is that to be able to use this to inform design. And what this framing does for us is just make that has made it very explicit as a way to share with learners. So then they're really thinking very clearly about how it is that they're going to, especially as they're starting to conceptualize their projects, what it is that they think is going to happen, why they think it's going to work. And they usually do have ideas. But this helps make those ideas, puts a frame where they can be sort of made concrete and then interrogated.
If I can just piggyback on that, there are some conversations that are happening in the field of instructional and learning design right now that question the role of theory in developing educational interventions. And one of the things that I really value about the theories of change framework that you put forward is it is such a it's usable and it's pragmatic, and it sits at a meta level where you can kind of plug theories into it in a way where they make sense, where you can actually kind of, you have this algorithm, you know, if this, then this with this outcome. So just wanted to put that out there. I know that Dr. Glazer, who's here with us today, has some thoughts on that as well. I don't know if you might want to chime in.
Putting me on the spot. The role of theory and role of theory in design. Oh no, this is a contentious issue that I have with other people and colleagues, where I'm a very active believer that I never consider theory in my work. And I half jokingly say, usually with a drink at a bar at a conference, that anyone who says that they use theory in a meaningful way in their designs is exaggerating.
Okay,
But
I'm
to me,
loving this. Tell me, Noah. So you don't have any theories about what would make a good design?
I don't use theory in my work. I don't consider it. If
No. I didn't ask you if you use theory. I asked you if you have any theories.
Oh no, I
No.
I mostly just try to design around the affordances of the technology in a way that meets the learning objective for the population it's being designed.
And how in the world do you know what way that would be?
So for instance, a lot of the work I do in virtual reality, I'll just give a quick example. I do a lot of virtual reality interventions for usually autistic adults. And if we're trying to teach like behavioral skills, for instance, it would make sense to design around behavioral fidelity and congruency from the virtual environment to the real environment. And what you see, I find plenty of papers that cite theory out the wazoo, but then in practice, they have people hitting the space bar so that they can wave their arm and interact with something. Well, that doesn't make any sense. They're not learning anything from that. But if you design around the actual skill that you're trying to teach, and you do a task analysis around it, and then you intentionally design for learning and or generalization, then it's going to probably make more sense.
See, I would argue that you're citing all kinds of theory right there in what you're just talking about. Behavioral fidelity, that's transfer.
Yeah.
There's lots of theory about transfer, right? And okay,
Yeah.
maybe you don't need to cite the papers because you have pretty good expertise in the space already, and you're not going to slow down to look up the papers and make the citations. But the minute you're talking to anybody else about why are you doing this way, and why are you not doing it some completely different way, like hitting the space bar, it might be useful to be able to cite the literature on that.
Yeah,
My thought.
I agree, and I have this debate like with people, like if I can design it without citing the theory, then the theory probably isn't important. I couldn't cite
Where did you
the theory
learn the things that
around it.
you, well, okay, I mean, there's lots of
Yeah.
people who don't cite their work, right? Or cite their sources.
Sure.
And,
Many.
you know, yeah,
Well,
many.
If I might jump in with a question. After the fact, when you have a design that is successfully working, do you ever articulate, to yourself or to others, why you think it's working? Like you built it this way, it seems to be working. You don't have to explain why you think it. You just say, look, it's working. Why do I need to explain it? But does it ever become an object of curiosity, and potentially for the next design, like I'll try to do something similar?
Sure. I mean, so I'm working on a paper. In this line of research, there's all of 2 current papers that actually try and report evidence of generalization, and that spans about 30 years of research. Most of the papers are very show and tell. it's currently presenting some evidence to show transfer of skills, and the complexity of it all oftentimes limits the ability to do so. And we're bringing in some kind of concluding the paper with a great quote from Jonathan, who was kind of saying, like, trying to unpack it and figure out what design characteristic, what theory, what trait of any part of this led to the change in outcomes. Is kind of like, how did he phrase it? Like a fool's errand or something like that. I think there's so much complexity in learning, and we can't define what learning is half the time.
I respectfully disagree. I think if you don't define learning, then you're not working toward it.
Yeah. I'm saying that the learning is complex and hard to define.
Oh, it is.
For sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is difficult. And it's definitely a wicked problem, right? The definition of a wicked problem with interdependent variables that are constantly changing, and it's complex, not complicated, depending on, which paper you want to cite. There's no doubt about that. And part of the problem, and this is where theories of change actually becomes useful. Part of the problem is defining the problem.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so by articulating who's learning what and how you're planning on getting them there, you then create a roadmap where you can actually like try different things and test your assumptions. And listen, the thing about the citing your sources and all that kind of thing, I don't want to pretend that everything is an academic exercise, although I do think academic communication is important, right? And ultimately, otherwise you're just reinventing the wheel in tiny little places all over the place, right? So we need to be sharing what we're doing and participating in a larger conversation. But a large part of the work that a theory of change will do for you is push you to go to the literature to find out what's my best guess, right? And it sounds like you're very well established in one particular field, so you already know that stuff. But if you were to start over in a new field, you might want to start by finding out what people have done before and to take the shortcuts so you don't go down a rabbit hole on something that turns out has been shown not to work, right?
Oh, yeah.
Good example, recent example is that we have a lot of people who believe strongly in learning styles. And it's like, oh, I'm a visual learner and therefore I'm going to see everything in pictures. And it's like, okay, you know what? The literature has shown that although we have certain advantages to showing things in multiple representations, and yes, we want to include all students and all of those good things that come out of CAST and understanding by design and so on, the idea that one person gets to choose one way of learning things is, debunked, right? Yes, interpretive dance, my favorite too.
One thing that really
let's
helps.
agree to disagree, or to put theory in certain places, but maybe not citing citations every day. Go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, also perhaps a little bit by way of synthesis. I mean, one of the things that's helpful about this conversation for me is that, it's not one thing that a presentation like we've just provided, we're trying to sort of explain after the fact, these various design iterations. But of course, we all know that design iterations are complicated and messy and recursive, and so we don't want to oversimplify that way. And also, we're not really suggesting that there's a simple order of operations. Like you come up with a learning problem, and the first thing you should do is hit Google Scholar. No, not at all. And in fact, it's a very a design. We would typically encourage designers first to learn about the learners before they jump into any kind of theory, to really study the learners and their context, design thinking, empathize, that those are probably, if there's any order to anything, those are probably usually better first steps than just sort of jumping into the library. But that in this, so I think that's a well taken point, and there's really no one size fits all to the way people do their recursive design, but definitely not the idea that you have to start with a literature review. That it's really good to start with the learners themselves and getting to know them. But somewhere in that cycle, you tend to say, yeah, well, this seems to be working, and you can say, look, I'm not even going to ask myself about why it's working. If it's just working, it's working. I don't need to know why. But then sometimes you say, well, if I understand better, like what's happening here, I might be able to, enhance the effect. Like it's working a little, maybe there's ways to make it work a lot. And, ideas, why you think it's working, those kind of things tend to come to you. And those are and what we're suggesting is that throughout that iterative process, thinking about what your ideas are, why do I think this is working? And then basically research is really just like, who else has worked on this? Who else has been confronted with similar problems to the ones I'm facing in this project? And what, if anything, can I learn from them? And what, if anything, has been abstracted from a lot of people working in this similar problem space? And how does what I'm working on fit into that? So those are the kind of things.
Yes,
And I think
I
really consistent with the idea that you want to probably check in with learners very early on.
I completely agree. And I do want to reiterate what Keith just said about, we make it look pretty in this presentation, but it's not. It's a living, breathing document that changes all the time, if it's a document at all. But you want to be revisiting it, revising it, changing it. Another point about why going to the literature even matters, like in the motion math example, they wanted it to be fun. What does that even mean, right? You can find a variety of different suggestions, ideas by going to the literature and saying, oh, well, game theory, people who study gamers and their motivations say that there are at least 8 different reasons why people come and play games and enjoy games. So if that's what we want, if we want to define fun, we might want to think about different ways of making it fun for different people. And whereas we might have an idea of our own coming in of like, oh, this is what makes it fun. It might be, well, we can also do these other things. We can make it meaningful. We can make it all sorts of social and hard and aesthetically pleasing and so on. I have seen in the chat that there's a question that came up a couple of times, connection between theory of change and activity theory. So I would say activity theory fits as, how do I overlap them? I would say that on the one hand, I would definitely want to look at the learner through the lens of an activity system, right? We've got the subject, but we've got the object, but we've also got all these other pieces, right? That could influence what we consider to be important in this learning design. And I think you could argue that some of the instruments and mediating artifacts are what we're designing. So I could see sort of a taking it apart and putting it back together. By the way, our diagram is in no way like exclusive or important. I mean, it's just one way of looking at it, and it's fairly simple. There are lots more things you can do. So I think it's very compatible with an activity system diagram, but ours focuses a little bit more on that piece that we're trying to design in the middle of like, what's the secret sauce there? You could also use the activity system diagram to prompt you to think about different kinds of interventions you could do. Changing the division of labor, changing the rules, changing what the community environment is, and sort of using those as levers to impact the outcome. So I see lots of different ways of integrating those two.
We do definitely appreciate your, putting it out there with a, with a good challenging question, to be sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's a question that will continue to arise as we have emerging scholars in the field who are questioning some of the canon that we have developed in the past. So that's what we're supposed to do as scholars.
Absolutely.
In any case, we are at time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.